Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story. The 17 eggs had been sitting in the Imperial hatchery for 60 years. That was normal for Dracovians. Their eggs were patient things, thick-shelled and slow, warmed by volcanic vents deep beneath the palace of Vorathis. The whole empire waited for this clutch. 17 eggs meant 17 new warriors, possibly generals, maybe even a future king. The nobles filled the gallery above the hatchery floor. Soldiers stood in full ceremonial armor along the walls. The imperial herald held his recording staff and tried to look calm. The first egg cracked at dawn. The hatchling that came out was enormous, already the size of a grown horse, scales blazing deep red, wings spreading wide the moment they hit open air. The crowd roared. The herald announced the name. More eggs followed, one after another, each hatchling larger and louder than anything the humans visiting the summit had ever imagined possible. 16 hatchlings stood in a line by midday, each one radiating heat, each one already trying to breathe fire and mostly succeeding. The 17th egg had not moved. The crowd grew quiet. Then it began to crack, slowly, without drama. What came out was not what anyone expected. The hatchling was small, smaller than small. It stood roughly the height of a large dog, gray-scaled where all the others were red or bronze or deep gold. Its wings were short and folded flat against its back, like they were ashamed to be seen. It blinked at the crowd with pale yellow eyes and did not make a sound. For a moment no one spoke. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. Then the whole gallery was laughing, and the herald was struggling to keep his face still, and the 16 other hatchlings turned to look at this small grey thing standing alone at the crack of the last egg. Commander Orath was standing near the front. He was the head of the imperial military, broad as a doorway, with black scales and a voice like grinding stone. He looked at the small hatchling for a long moment and then said, loudly enough for the gallery to hear, "Someone check if the vent coughed up a lizard by mistake." More laughter. The small hatchling did not react. It simply looked at Orath with those pale yellow eyes, then looked around the hatchery slowly, as if measuring the room. High above, seated on the stone observation throne, King Dravok watched. He was ancient, enormous, and completely still. He did not laugh. He did not speak. He watched the small grey hatchling stand alone on the hatchery floor, and he said nothing at all. The hatchling was registered under the name Ryun. The herald almost skipped the name entirely. The record was filed at the bottom of the clutch list, below a footnote that said, "Minimal viability. Assigned to crawler caste pending further assessment." Crawler caste. Message carriers. Record keepers. The ones who scurried through the lower halls of the palace, doing the work that no real warrior would touch. It was the lowest rung of Dracovian society, occupied mostly by the old, the injured, and the forgotten. Hyun was given a small room in the archive wing. It had no windows. It smelled like old stone and dusty record rolls. The other young hatchlings trained in the fire yards above, and their roars shook the ceiling sometimes. Ryun listened to the sounds and said nothing. What Ryun did, instead of complaining, was read. The archive wing held everything the Dracovian Empire had ever recorded. Battle histories, engineering schematics for every class of warship ever built, galactic cartography going back 400 years, intelligence assessments on every neighboring species, trade routes, structural blueprints for orbital stations from 40 different empires. The archivists let him read whatever he wanted because no one thought it mattered. The runt of the clutch, sitting in a corner with scrolls bigger than his whole body, reading things that no hatchling was supposed to care about. One of the archivists, an old Dracovian named Feth with a missing left horn, sometimes watched Ryun work. One day Feth asked him why he spent so much time on the military schematics. Ryun looked up. Because someone should. Feth had no answer for that. It was near the end of that first long season that the human delegation arrived. A diplomatic ship from somewhere called Earth, small and silver, landed in the upper docking bay for a trade summit. Ryun was not allowed near the upper levels, but the archive wing had a narrow ventilation slit near the ceiling, and if he climbed the shelving carefully, he could see through it to the courtyard below. He watched the humans walk off their ship. They were tiny, pink skinned and soft looking, with no scales, no wings, no natural armor of any kind. Every Dracovian in the courtyard either ignored them or looked faintly amused. The humans seemed to know they were being looked down on. They walked anyway. They carried small devices, and they looked at everything with quick, sharp eyes. One of them, a woman in a worn grey coat, stopped in the middle of the courtyard and looked directly up at the ventilation slit where Yun was watching. She could not possibly see him. The slit was too small and too high, but she looked directly at it anyway, as if she knew something was there. Ryun stayed very still. Then she looked away and followed the others. Yoon climbed down from the shelving slowly. He filed away what he had just seen in the same careful way he filed away schematics and battle maps. He did not know why yet. He was patient. He had time. He went back to his reading. 8 years passed the way stone wears, slowly, without announcement. Ryun grew. Not much, and not in the ways that mattered to anyone who counted such things. He never reached warrior size. His wings stayed too short for proper flight, good only for short gliding bursts between high ledges. His fire ran hot but narrow, more like a cutting torch than the wide, devastating wall of flame the soldiers trained to produce. If you stood him next to any of his clutch brothers, the difference was almost funny. They were mountains, he was a stone, but he was a very sharp stone. His legs had grown fast and quiet. He could move through the lower palace corridors without a single claw tap on the stone. His memory had become something the archivists talked about in low voices. Feth once tested him by asking about a battle record Ryun had read 3 years prior. Ryun recited 6 pages of it without pausing. Feth did not test him again. The courier work was boring, and the mockery was constant. Soldiers in the upper halls called him the Grey Mouse when they were in good moods and other things when they were not. His clutch brothers did not bother to insult him anymore. They had simply stopped registering him as relevant, which was worse in its own way. Commander Orath passed him in a corridor once and looked straight through him, the way you look through furniture. Ryun took every courier route the dispatch office gave him. He took extra ones. He took the routes no one else wanted, the long runs to distant outposts, the boring supply check routes to orbital platforms, the maintenance deliveries to stations so old they were not even on the current military maps. He said he was being diligent. That was true. It was not the only truth. He was mapping everything. Every facility he visited, he memorized entry points, guard rotations, internal pressure systems, the structural type of each station, whether it was Dracovian built, captured and repurposed, or one of the older joint construction types from before the Empire had stopped bothering with allies. He kept no written notes. He did not need to. In his 4th year of courier work, he was briefly thrown into a combat training drill, not as a participant, as a target. 3 young warrior trainees were told to practice their encirclement technique on the small courier. It was supposed to take less than a minute. It took 47. Ryun did not beat them. He was not trying to beat them. He moved around them into spaces too narrow for their bulk, reversing directions the moment they committed to a charge, using the geometry of the training yard against 3 beings who had been taught to fight in open sky and wide ground. When the drill supervisor finally called it off, the 3 trainees were winded and faintly humiliated, and Ryun had not been touched once. Orath heard about it. He said, "Let the lizard have his little trick. It will not matter in a real fight." Ryun said nothing. He went back to his roots. It was on one of the outer platform runs that he picked up the signal. It was fragmented, broken into pieces, the way someone breaks a message when they do not want it read whole. Ryun was waiting in a signal relay room for a transmission to finish when he noticed the fragments cycling through a low band channel. He had read enough of the old intelligence archives to recognize the pattern. Someone was communicating in layered code, the kind the syndicate had used 20 years ago during the border skirmishes, before the Empire had driven them back. He gathered what he could, rebuilt the fragments from memory that night, and wrote a formal report. He submitted it through the standard channels, marked it priority high, and signed his name at the bottom. 3 days later, he got a response. It was one line. It said noted, filed. It was not signed. He knew what that meant. He started preparing anyway, quietly, with no authorization and no support. He identified 3 routes to the neutral summit station where King Dravok would be traveling in 6 months. He memorized the syndicate station schematics he had read 4 years ago as part of a historical archive package that Feth had assigned him as busy work. He began training his gliding, pushing the short wings to their limit every night on the lower cliff edges of the palace's exterior. He did not know exactly what was coming. He knew something was. It was during one of these outer route runs that he crossed paths again with the Ironback. The human salvage ship was docked at a Dracovian orbital platform, taking on emergency repairs after something had hit them in the debris fields near the outer belt. The dock officer wanted 3 times the standard fee. The human captain, a solid, weathered man named Rourke, was arguing in the middle of the bay with the volume of someone who had spent his life being the loudest thing in the room. Every Dracovian in the bay was ignoring him. That was the standard response to humans. Ryun walked over. He stood between Rourke and the dock officer and laid out a compromise in 9 sentences. Fee reduction in exchange for a public registry credit that the platform could use to demonstrate cross-species cooperation for the quarterly Imperial report. Both sides got something. Neither side had to back down completely. Rourke stared at the small grey dragon for a long moment. "You're not like the others," he said. Ryun looked at him. "Neither are you." He picked up his courier bag and finished his route. The attack on the border worlds began on a day when the sky over Vorathis was the color of cooling iron. 3 systems hit at once. Mining colonies at the edge of Dracovian territory, far enough out that the signal delays made the news arrive ragged and incomplete. The war horns in the palace rang for the first time in 11 years. Soldiers ran for their posts. Commanders were pulled out of their morning briefings. Orath was in front of a war map within minutes, already issuing deployment orders with the calm of someone who had waited for exactly this. Ryun was carrying a message cylinder to the lower communications hall when he heard the horns. He stopped walking. He stood very still in the corridor and thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned around and went back to the archive wing. He had read the Syndicate's tactical history 20 times. He knew their patterns the way he knew the weight of his own courier bag. They did not attack 3 places at once because they had the strength to hold 3 places at once. They attacked 3 places at once to make you look at 3 places at once. He pulled out the galactic chart he had been quietly updating for months and looked at where King Dravok was going to be in 4 days. The neutral summit station. Light hours from the nearest military response point. Traveling with a reduced escort. Ryun wrote a report. He was fast. The fastest he had ever been. 6 pages of analysis with times, distances and fleet positions. All from memory, all correct. He took it to Orath's war room himself because the message runners were all backed up. Orath was standing over the deployment table with 4 generals and did not look up when Ryun came in. Ryun put the report on the edge of the table. "The border strikes are a feint. The real target is the king." Orath looked at the report. Then he looked at Ryun. The 4 generals looked at Ryun. The courier is reading battle maps now, Orath said. I have been reading battle maps for 8 years, Ryun said. Someone should. One of the generals actually laughed. Orath pushed the report aside. We have 3 systems under attack, and you want me to redirect forces based on the analysis of a crawl runner. Go back to your roots, small one. Leave strategy to the ones built for it. Ryun picked up his report. He looked at it for a moment, then he folded it and put it in his bag and left the room without another word. He went to the lower docking bay. There was a small scout pod in Bay 9, old enough that it was not on the current roster and had never been assigned a lock code. No one thought anyone would bother stealing a 40-year-old survey pod that barely had jump capacity. He took it. He was 3 hours out from Vorathis, running on minimum power to avoid the sensor nets when the debris field caught him. It was not on any of the maps he had memorized because it was new. Recent collision debris from one of the border skirmishes, spreading through the transit lane like shattered glass. The pod took 3 hits in 8 seconds. The navigation array went down. The secondary drive started cycling wrong. Yun was running calculations on how long he had before the pod became a very small and very permanent part of the debris field when something large came out of the dark and pulled him in with a magnetic tow line. The Ironback. It was the same ship, same hull markings, same patch section on the port side that Doss had welded and re-welded so many times it had its own unique texture. They hauled the pod into the cargo bay, and Rourke was standing there with his arms crossed when Ryun climbed out. You, Rourke said. Me, Ryun agreed. You're alone, in a survey pod, in a debris field, in Syndicate border space. Yes. Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Why? Ryun told him. All of it, the signal fragments, the report, the border feint, the King's travel route. What would happen if no one got there in 4 days? He spoke for 6 minutes. He did not repeat himself. He used plain language. When he finished, the cargo bay was very quiet. Rourke looked at his navigator, a young woman named Sura, who was standing near the bay door. She had been listening with her arms crossed and her eyes moving across Ryun's face the whole time with an expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite belief, but something alive and calculating between the two. He's not wrong, she said. Rourke looked at his engineer, Doss, who had come down from the upper deck during the speech and was leaning in the doorway with a wrench in one hand. Doss said, The numbers work. He checked 3 of them in my head. They work. Rourke was quiet for a long time. He looked at the small grey dragon standing in his cargo bay. He thought about the route, the timeline, the odds, the complete absence of any good reason to do this. Then he thought about the docking fee argument 2 years ago, and a dragon who had walked over when no one else did. Sura, he said, change the heading. She was already moving. Ryun got back in the pod long enough to grab the only thing he had brought, his rolled map, updated by hand to the last known syndicate station positions. He tucked it under one arm and followed the humans. He had 4 days. That was enough. Grath's cradle did not look like a fortress from the outside. It looked like a rock, a dead asteroid, grey and pitted, tumbling slowly through the dark at the edge of a dust belt where long-range sensors got noisy and unreliable. That was the point. Syndicate construction teams had carved the interior out over decades. Halls and cells and weapon bays bored into the rock like the inside of a dead tooth. From space, there was almost nothing to see. Few heat signatures. A faint power bloom if you knew where to point your instruments. Ryun knew where to point them. He had read the old Imperial survey files on this type of construction. Once, 4 years ago, as busy work Feth had given him. He had read all of it anyway. Sura confirmed the heat signatures from the navigation console. He's in there. Deep, low levels. Rourke looked at the station on the display for a long time. It was enormous. The asteroid was nearly 3 kilometers across. Every docking port they could identify had active sensor coverage. 3 syndicate patrol ships were holding position in a slow orbit around it. "We can't dock," Dawes said. "They'll flag us the moment we make approach." "We do not need to dock," Ryun said. He was looking at the station schematic he had drawn from memory on a sheet of Dawes's spare grid paper. He tapped a point on the lower quadrant of the rock. "There, maintenance access shaft, 60 centimeters in diameter. It connects to the internal pressure equalization system. These old asteroid conversions always have them on the south-facing side to vent thermal buildup from the power core." Rourke stared at the schematic. 60 centimeters. That is not big enough for any of us. "It is big enough for me," Ryun said. He looked at Sura. "And it is just big enough for you if you leave the outer gear here." Sura looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at the ceiling like he was asking it for patience. "2 of you," he said, "in a maintenance shaft, in a syndicate fortress, to break out a Dragon King." "Yes," Ryun said. Dawes said, "I'll hold the ship close to the rock's shadow side. Harder to spot there. I can keep us dark for about 90 minutes before the heat buildup starts showing on their scans." 90 minutes. Ryun calculated. It was tight, but it was possible. Sura was already removing her outer armor vest. They went in through the shaft with a rope line back to the ironback's exterior hatch. The inside of the shaft was dark and smelled like hot iron and old rock. Sura moved behind Ryun, following his directions by touch and by the dim green light of a single chemical glow strip she had taped to her wrist. Ryun went ahead slowly, feeling the walls, counting junction points from memory. He had never been inside this station. He had only read about this type, but the builders had used the same structural logic for over 100 years. Because rock is rock, and pressure physics do not change, and Ryun had read every page of that logic until it was as familiar as the palace archive corridors. At the third junction, he disabled a sensor relay by pressing 2 contact points together with a thin piece of metal from Dawes's kit. The relay thought it was doing a self-test. It ignored them. At the fifth junction, Sura used a human data spike on a wall panel. Dracovian security had been built to resist Dracovian intrusion. Nobody had updated it against human tools, because nobody had imagined needing to. The panel opened. They went down. The cell block was built for enormous prisoners. The doors were 3 meters tall, sealed with stellar-grade restraint locks. Ryun looked at them and understood immediately. He could not break these. Neither could Sura. No amount of cleverness would unfasten a lock designed to hold a Dragon King. He looked at Sura. She was already opening her kit. Inside, King Dravok was chained to the far wall. He was very still, conserving energy the way old soldiers do when they know the fight is coming but is not yet. His eyes found Ryun the moment the access panel slid back. He looked at the small grey hatchling for a long moment. "I knew you would come," Dravok said. His voice was very quiet, measured. "I have been waiting." Ryun said nothing. He looked at the restraint locks. He looked back at Sura. Sura had a shaped explosive charge in her hand, a hull-cutting tool, used in salvage work to open sections of wrecked ships. She looked at the lock mountings. She looked at Ryun. "Where?" she said. Ryun pointed. 2 points, 3 centimeters apart, at the base of the left anchor bracket. He had calculated the yield in his head while they were moving through the shaft. Sura placed the charge. They moved to the far side of the access panel. The sound was not loud. It was precise, a sharp, directed crack, the way good tools sound when they do exactly what they are supposed to do. The lock shattered at the anchor point. The chain went slack. Dravok rose. He filled the cell. He filled the room beyond it. His wings spread, and the chains fell from him like old thread. He looked down at Ryun and Sura, the small grey dragon and the small soft human, standing in the doorway of his cell. Then the alarm sounded. Ryun stepped back. So did Sura. "This part," Ryun said calmly, "is yours, my king." Dravok looked at the door, then at the corridor beyond. He exhaled once, slow and very hot. What happened to the Syndicate soldiers in that corridor is not a story that needs much detail. The fortress shook. The first thing Dravok did was roar. It was not a battle roar, though it shook dust from the ceiling and set off two secondary alarms in adjacent sections. It was something older than that. A sound Ryun had only read about in the historical war records. A sound that older Dracovian texts called the release. It was the sound a being that large makes when it has been still too long and finally is not. Then Dravok moved. Ryun and Sura pressed flat against the corridor wall as the king went past them. What followed was not a fight in any organized sense. Syndicate soldiers came from three directions, and then very quickly they were not coming from any direction. The soldiers had been built and trained and equipped to hold a chained prisoner. They had not been built for this. The fortress rang like a struck bell for 3 long minutes and then went quiet. Ryun was already moving. He did not wait to watch. He had the map in his head. The path back to the maintenance shaft, 12 turns and 2 level drops, and the shaft itself was still their only way out because the docking bays would be on full alert by now. He ran, and Sura ran behind him, and they made it through 6 of the 12 turns before the soldiers found them. Not Syndicate regulars. These were faster, heavy armor units pulled from the station reserve, 4 of them blocking the corridor ahead with weapons up. Behind Ryun and Sura, the sounds of Dravok's progress were getting louder, moving through the station like a fire through dry grass. The soldiers were not looking at Dravok. They were looking at the two small things in front of them. The side passage, Sura said quietly, without pointing. Ryun had already seen it. A maintenance branch, barely wide enough for one of them, running parallel to the main corridor. The soldiers would never fit. Ryun and Sura were through it before the soldiers processed what was happening. They came out behind the soldiers. They kept running. Outside, the Ironback was not in a good position. Rourke had kept the ship in the asteroid's shadow for as long as he could, but the Syndicate patrol ships had finished their orbit, and one of them was running an active sensors sweep that would find the Ironback in about 4 minutes. Doss had the ship's plasma cutter, normally used to slice open wreck hulls, jury-rigged into a forward mount on the external frame. It was not a weapon system. The mounting was held with 2 bolts and a great deal of Doss's personal confidence. "They're going to see us," Doss said. "I know," Rourke said. "We can't outrun a patrol ship. I know that too. So what's the plan?" Rourke was quiet for a moment. Wait. He had been running the numbers in his head since Ryun had explained the mission, and the number he kept coming back to was not a distance or a time. It was a size. Specifically, how large a Dracovian king was when freed and angry and moving through a pressurized structure at full force. The station's outer hull bulged near the lower quadrant. Then it cracked. Then it opened, with a sound they felt more than heard through the ship's hull, and King Dravok came out of the asteroid the way something that has been compressed too long comes out when the pressure finally breaks. All at once, in every direction, the patrol ships scattered. 2 of them turned to engage. This was a decision they made for professional reasons and regretted very quickly. Dravok in open space was a different problem from any they had been equipped to handle. He was fast in a way that nothing that large should be fast, and his fire in vacuum ran on the biological oxidizer system that all Dracovians carried internally. It burned hot, and it burned long, and it burned very specifically at whatever he was looking at. The patrol ship stopped engaging. "Now," Rourke said. Doss fired the plasma cutter at the third patrol ship that had been circling around toward the Ironback's blind side. The beam was not calibrated as a weapon. It was calibrated for cutting 10 centimeter wreck steel. Against a patrol ship's lateral sensor array, it worked considerably better than that. The third ship broke off. Ryun and Sura reached the maintenance shaft. They went through fast. Sura came out of the exterior hatch, breathing hard, and grabbed the safety line, and Ryun came out behind her, and the ironback pulled them in before the hatch had fully closed. Rourke was standing in the cargo bay. He looked at Ryun. He looked at Sura. He looked through the bay's small porthole at the enormous shape of Dravok holding position outside waiting. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he extended his hand, the human gesture, open palm, an offering without requirement. Ryun looked at the hand. He had read about handshakes. He had seen them in the diplomatic footage. He considered it for a moment the way he considered everything, quickly and completely. Then he placed one small clawed hand against the human palm. Roar closed his hand carefully around it, just for a moment. Then he let go. Outside, Dravok moved alongside the ironback. He was enormous. The ship was tiny beside him. He opened a comm channel and spoke in human language. Imperfect, deliberate. These small ones helped my bloodkin. Remember that. The crew of the ironback was quiet. Doss said from the doorway. Did he just make us family? Sura said. I think he did. Rourke looked at the porthole for a long moment. Then he went back to the bridge. There was still a course to plot. The story arrived on Vorathis before Ryun did. Stories always moved faster than the people in them. By the time the Ironback docked at the upper orbital platform and Dravok came down through the atmosphere in a long arc of fire that half the planet could see, everyone in the Imperial Court already knew something of what had happened. They just had the details wrong in the specific ways that rumors always got details wrong. Too much fire, too many enemies, the numbers inflated to make the story feel worthy of a king. The truth was quieter and more unsettling to them. The truth was a small grey courier, a human salvage crew, a maintenance shaft, and a shaped explosive charge. Orath was in the throne room when Ryun entered. He was standing with the four generals he had been with when Ryun had put the report on his table and been dismissed. They were all in full ceremonial armor. They had expected the king's return to be an occasion for soldiers. They had not expected it to be an occasion for this. Ryun walked in behind Dravok. He was still carrying his courier bag. He had not had time to change anything about himself, and he had not thought to try. Dravok stood at the center of the throne room and let the silence build until it was heavy. Then he spoke. He did not use the formal court address. He used the old speaking style, the one from the war records that Ryun had read hundreds of times, direct and plain, the way commanders spoke after battles, when there was nothing left to perform. He said that Ryun had seen the threat before anyone with the authority to act had believed it was real. He said that Ryun had acted anyway, without permission, without support, without recognition, the way that actual courage worked when the people holding the permissions and the support and the recognition were looking at the wrong map. He said that the humans of the Ironback had done something the Imperial military had not. They had listened. The room was very still. Orath's face did not move, but something behind it did. Dravok raised one hand. He spoke the old words of the title that had not been granted in 300 years. Vrathkal. In Old Dracovian it meant, one who is small and fills the sky. It had been given once to a scout who had walked alone into an enemy fortress and come back with the information that won a war. It had been given once to a healer who had kept an entire army alive during a siege. It had never been given to a hatchling. It had never been given to anyone from the crawler caste. The generals looked at each other. Orath, per the tradition, bound to that title, knelt, not as submission, not as an apology, as acknowledgement of demonstrated excellence, which in Dracovian law was a separate and non-negotiable thing. His face was stone. He knelt anyway, because the law was the law. And Dravok had spoken the old words, and there was nothing else to do. Ryun looked at Orath kneeling. He did not smile. He did not say anything. He let the moment be what it was, and then he looked away, because gloating was a waste of time. In the weeks that followed, the Ironback was granted permanent safe passage through all Dracovian space. The three crew members were formally registered as bloodkin of the royal line, which came with trading rights, diplomatic immunity, and the legal right to call on Dracovian military assistance if they ever needed it badly enough to invoke the bond. Rourke read the document 3 times. Then he sat down and poured a drink and stared at nothing for a while. Doss framed his copy of the document and hung it in the engine room. Sura accepted the position of diplomatic attaché and stayed on Vorathis for a year. In the Imperial military, analysts went through the records from Grath's cradle in detail. They studied the maintenance shaft. They studied the sensor relay disable. They studied the human data spike on the Dracovian security panel. A quiet and uncomfortable conversation began in the lower halls of the military command, passing between officers in the careful language that powerful people use when they realize they have been wrong about something for a very long time. One analyst wrote a report. It said, "We have had human vessels moving through our space for 40 years, and we have never once considered what they might be capable of doing inside our own systems, because we assumed that anything small was not a threat." The report was read. It was not filed without action this time. A formal diplomatic envoy was sent to Earth. For the first time, Ryun heard about this and said nothing. He was standing at the edge of a high parapet on the palace exterior, looking out at the volcanic sky. When Sura came and stood beside him, she said, "They are going to sing songs about you." Ryun was quiet for a moment. Then, "Songs take up too much room. I prefer maps." He turned and went back inside. Feth was waiting for him at the archive entrance with a new stack of records. Recent intelligence material from the outer systems, flagged as low priority, probably nothing. Ryun picked up the stack. He went to his desk. He began to read.